What if 30 minutes, roughly the length of a single television episode, done consistently every single day, could genuinely reshape how your heart functions after 50, through a series of specific, measurable changes that build on each other week after week? Most people know walking is good for their heart in some general sense, the kind of vague, background knowledge everyone absorbs without necessarily understanding the actual mechanics behind it. But when researchers look specifically at what happens inside your cardiovascular system when you commit to 30 minutes of daily walking, consistently, over weeks and months, the picture becomes considerably more specific and considerably more compelling than a general, background sense that walking is simply healthy. So today we're going to walk through exactly what happens to your heart at each stage of building this habit, from your very first walk through months of consistent practice, the specific physiological changes occurring at each phase, and why 30 minutes daily represents such a genuinely meaningful, evidence-supported target for cardiovascular health after 50. Before we begin, remember this video is for education only. If you have diagnosed heart disease or haven't been physically active recently, please speak with your doctor before beginning a new exercise routine, since your individual situation may call for a more gradual approach or specific guidance beyond general population recommendations. Now, let's begin. Most people ask, is walking good for my heart? But that framing treats cardiovascular benefit as a single, static fact rather than what it actually is, a genuinely dynamic, progressive process that unfolds through distinct, identifiable stages as your body adapts to consistent activity. The better question is, what specifically happens to my heart during a single walk, and how does that change as I build this into a genuinely consistent, daily habit over weeks and months? Because understanding this progression, rather than simply accepting walking is good for you as a vague, background fact, gives you a genuinely motivating, concrete picture of what's actually happening beneath the surface at each stage of building this habit. Here is why this specific target, 30 minutes daily, carries such genuine relevance after 50 specifically. Cardiovascular disease risk factors, including blood pressure changes, arterial stiffening, and shifts in cholesterol patterns, tend to become more prevalent and more clinically significant during this decade and beyond, making consistent, moderate cardiovascular exercise increasingly relevant as a genuinely protective intervention rather than simply a general wellness recommendation. Additionally, 30 minutes represents a duration extensively studied in cardiovascular research specifically, with major health organizations consistently pointing toward this approximate daily target, or 150 minutes weekly, as associated with meaningfully reduced cardiovascular risk across large population studies, making it a genuinely evidence-grounded target rather than an arbitrary, generic recommendation. Think of your cardiovascular system's response to consistent walking like the process of training a muscle you can't directly see or feel working, since your heart is, after all, itself a muscle, responding to consistent demand in ways genuinely similar to how your visible skeletal muscles respond to resistance training discussed in other conversations. Just as consistent resistance training gradually makes your arm or leg muscles stronger and more efficient, consistent cardiovascular exercise like daily walking gradually makes your heart muscle itself stronger and more efficient, along with producing a cascade of related changes throughout your blood vessels and broader circulatory system, changes that unfold progressively rather than appearing immediately after a single walk. Let's start with what happens during a single walk itself, the immediate, short-term response your heart experiences during those 30 minutes. As you begin walking, your heart rate increases to meet the increased oxygen demand from your working leg muscles, and your blood vessels dilate somewhat to accommodate increased blood flow to those active muscles. This immediate response causes a temporary, modest increase in blood pressure during the activity itself, a completely normal, healthy response to increased physical demand, followed by a period after the walk ends where blood pressure often drops modestly below your pre-walk baseline for a period of time, a phenomenon called post-exercise hypertension. Even a single walk produces this immediate, if temporary, cardiovascular benefit, though the more meaningful, lasting changes discussed throughout the rest of this video require this stimulus to be repeated consistently over an extended period. The second thing that happens, occurring over the first few weeks of consistent daily walking, involves your resting heart rate specifically. As your heart adapts to regular activity, it gradually becomes more efficient at pumping blood with each individual beat, meaning it needs to beat somewhat fewer times per minute to circulate the same volume of blood throughout your body, even while you're simply resting. Many people notice a modest but genuine decrease in their resting heart rate after several weeks of consistent daily walking, a change that reflects genuine, measurable improvement in cardiac efficiency. Since a heart that can accomplish its essential work with fewer beats per minute is generally operating with greater overall efficiency and experiencing somewhat less cumulative strain over the course of each day compared to a heart requiring more frequent beats to accomplish the same essential Circulatory work. The third thing that happens, unfolding over a similar early timeframe, involves your blood vessels' flexibility and responsiveness specifically. Consistent walking has been shown in research to support improved endothelial function, referring to the health and responsiveness of the thin layer of cells lining the inside of your blood vessels, which plays a genuinely important role in regulating blood vessel dilation and constriction appropriately in response to your body's changing needs. Improved endothelial function, supported by consistent walking, is associated with better overall blood vessel flexibility and responsiveness, a genuinely relevant benefit given the natural tendency toward blood vessel stiffening discussed in other conversations about aging and cardiovascular health. The fourth thing that happens, typically becoming more measurable after several weeks to a couple of months of consistency, involves blood pressure specifically, building on the immediate, temporary post-exercise effect already discussed. Consistent daily walking is associated in extensive research with meaningful, sustained reductions in resting blood pressure for many people, particularly those starting with blood pressure in the elevated or mildly high range, through a combination of the improved endothelial function already discussed, along with broader improvements in how efficiently your cardiovascular system manages blood volume and vascular resistance. This represents one of the more consistently, robustly supported cardiovascular benefits associated with regular walking specifically, connecting directly to other conversations about blood pressure management after 50. The fifth thing that happens, typically unfolding over a somewhat longer time frame of consistent practice, involves your cholesterol profile specifically. Regular walking has been associated with modest but genuinely meaningful improvements in cholesterol patterns for many people, including increases in high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, often referred to as the more protective cholesterol type, alongside modest reductions in triglycerides, a type of fat in your bloodstream associated with increased cardiovascular risk when chronically elevated. These changes tend to develop more gradually than the blood pressure and resting heart rate changes already discussed, often becoming more clearly measurable after a few months of consistent walking, representing a longer-term, cumulative benefit that continues developing well beyond the initial weeks of building this habit. Now let's talk about the sixth thing that happens, and this one involves a somewhat less commonly discussed but genuinely significant benefit: improved heart rate variability, a measure discussed in other conversations about breathing and nervous system balance, reflecting the natural, healthy variation in timing between individual heartbeats. Consistent moderate exercise like daily walking is associated with improved heart rate variability over time, reflecting better overall autonomic nervous system balance and adaptability, a marker increasingly recognized in cardiology research as relevant to overall cardiovascular resilience and even associated with reduced risk of certain cardiac events in some research populations. Now let's talk about the seventh and final major change, unfolding over the longest timeframe among those discussed today, involving actual structural changes within your heart muscle itself with sustained, consistent cardiovascular activity over many months and years. Research using cardiac imaging has found that consistent aerobic exercise, including regular walking, can be associated with modest, favorable changes in heart muscle structure and function over extended periods of consistent practice, including improved left ventricular function, referring to the primary pumping chamber of your heart responsible for circulating oxygenated blood throughout your body. These structural adaptations represent the most significant, if also the slowest to develop, category of change discussed throughout this video, requiring sustained consistency over months and years rather than weeks, but reflecting genuine, meaningful adaptation at the level of your heart's actual physical structure and function. Now, before we go further, let's debunk a few common myths about walking and heart health specifically. For years, many people believed that only vigorous, intense exercise produces meaningful cardiovascular benefit, dismissing moderate activities like walking as insufficient to produce genuine, measurable change. Some believed that cardiovascular benefits from walking, if they exist at all, should be immediately noticeable, becoming discouraged when a single walk or even a single week of walking doesn't produce dramatic, obvious change. Some believe that 30 minutes represents an arbitrary, made-up number rather than a genuinely evidence-based target extensively studied in cardiovascular research specifically. And some believe that once cardiovascular changes like arterial stiffening have begun with age, they're essentially permanent and unresponsive to lifestyle intervention. But when we look at the actual research and the progressive timeline discussed throughout today's video, the picture becomes considerably more encouraging and considerably more precise. The real questions are not simply, does walking feel challenging enough to seem like it must be working, or have I noticed dramatic change after just a few sessions? The better questions are, am I building genuine consistency, since the changes discussed today unfold progressively over weeks and months rather than appearing after isolated sessions? Am I maintaining this 30-minute target most days of the week, reflecting the extensively researched threshold associated with meaningful cardiovascular benefit? And am I giving this process adequate time, recognizing that resting heart rate and blood pressure changes typically become measurable within several weeks, while cholesterol improvements and structural heart changes require considerably longer, sustained consistency to fully develop? Now let's build a simple, practical framework for building this 30-minute daily walking habit specifically for cardiovascular benefit after 50. First, if you're currently inactive or haven't exercised regularly recently, begin gradually rather than immediately attempting a full 30 minutes, perhaps starting with 10 to 15 minutes and building up over 2 to 3 weeks, allowing your cardiovascular system to adapt progressively rather than placing sudden, significant demand on a system that hasn't recently managed this level of activity. Second, aim for a pace that feels moderately brisk, similar to the fat-burning walking speed discussed in other conversations, using the talk test to gauge appropriate intensity, since this moderate intensity level aligns with the research specifically discussed throughout today's video regarding cardiovascular benefit. Third, prioritize consistency over intensity, since the research discussed today consistently points toward regular, moderate activity most days of the week as more beneficial than occasional, more intense sessions, meaning missing an ideal pace on a particular day matters less than maintaining your overall daily consistency. Fourth, track your resting heart rate periodically, whether through a simple manual pulse check first thing in the morning or a fitness tracker if you have access to one, giving you a concrete, measurable way to observe the changes discussed earlier in today's video as they begin developing over the coming weeks. Fifth, be patient with the longer-term changes specifically, understanding that cholesterol improvements and structural heart adaptations genuinely require months of sustained consistency, meaning the full cardiovascular benefit of this habit continues developing well beyond your first several weeks of consistent walking. Let's talk a bit more about how to actually fit 30 minutes into a realistic daily routine, since this can feel like a genuinely significant time commitment for anyone with a busy schedule. Research suggests that walking doesn't necessarily need to occur in one single, continuous 30-minute session to produce meaningful cardiovascular benefit, with some studies finding that accumulated activity, such as 3 separate 10-minute walks spread throughout your day, can provide comparable benefit to a single continuous session for many of the outcomes discussed today, offering genuine flexibility for anyone who finds a single, uninterrupted 30-minute block genuinely difficult to consistently fit into their daily schedule. It's also worth addressing what to do on days when your schedule genuinely doesn't accommodate even this flexible, broken-up approach, since maintaining perfect, unbroken daily consistency isn't always realistic given the genuine demands of everyday life. Rather than viewing an occasional missed day as a failure that undermines your entire effort, understanding that the cardiovascular benefits discussed today develop from your overall, cumulative pattern of activity across weeks and months means an occasional shorter walk or missed day doesn't meaningfully undo the progressive adaptations already underway, provided your overall, general pattern remains consistently active across most days. Let's talk briefly about weather and seasonal considerations, since maintaining this consistency year-round matters considerably more for the cumulative, progressive benefits discussed throughout today's video than occasional walking only during more comfortable months. During periods of extreme heat, cold, or poor air quality, indoor alternatives, such as walking in a climate-controlled shopping mall, using a treadmill if available, or walking laps within your own home if outdoor conditions are genuinely unsafe or uncomfortable, provide a reasonable way to maintain your consistency without exposing yourself to genuinely hazardous outdoor conditions. Many communities offer mall walking programs specifically, sometimes with designated hours before stores open, providing a climate-controlled, socially engaging option that some people find genuinely more sustainable during challenging weather months than attempting to push through uncomfortable or unsafe outdoor conditions purely to maintain an unbroken streak. It's also worth mentioning the value of social walking specifically, since walking with a friend, spouse, or organized walking group can meaningfully support the long-term consistency that today's cardiovascular benefits genuinely depend on. Beyond the accountability and enjoyment social walking provides, some research suggests that the stress reduction and social connection benefits of walking with others may offer additional, complementary cardiovascular benefit beyond the direct physical activity itself, since chronic stress and social isolation both carry their own independent associations with cardiovascular risk, discussed in other conversations about health after 50. If maintaining daily consistency has felt genuinely difficult on your own, exploring whether a walking partner or local walking group might support your ongoing consistency represents a reasonable, evidence-informed strategy worth considering. Let's also briefly address footwear and injury prevention, since maintaining this habit consistently over the months required for the full range of benefits discussed today depends partly on avoiding the kind of discomfort or injury that might otherwise interrupt your consistency. As discussed in other conversations about walking mechanics, ensuring properly fitted, adequately cushioned footwear, along with attention to gradual progression rather than sudden, significant increases in duration or intensity, helps protect against the kind of discomfort or overuse issues that could otherwise derail an otherwise well-intentioned, consistent walking habit before it has the opportunity to produce the meaningful, progressive cardiovascular benefits discussed throughout today's video. For months or even years, and are wondering whether increasing their duration or intensity further would continue producing proportionally greater cardiovascular benefit. Research on cardiovascular exercise generally suggests a pattern of diminishing returns beyond a certain point, meaning the difference in cardiovascular benefit between 30 and 60 minutes of daily walking tends to be considerably smaller than the difference between complete inactivity and 30 minutes of daily walking. Though additional activity certainly isn't harmful for most healthy adults and may offer modest additional benefit, particularly if combined with occasional variation in pace or terrain, such as incorporating some incline walking discussed in other conversations, to introduce a somewhat greater cardiovascular demand periodically rather than simply extending the same moderate intensity duration further. And what about people managing an existing, diagnosed heart condition who are wondering whether this 30-minute daily target applies equally to their specific situation? This is precisely the population where individualized medical guidance carries the most direct relevance, since specific cardiac conditions may call for a modified approach, potentially including cardiac rehabilitation programs specifically designed to safely build cardiovascular fitness under appropriate medical supervision, rather than general population recommendations intended for adults without a specific, diagnosed cardiac condition. Discussing your specific situation directly with your cardiologist provides guidance considerably more relevant and appropriately tailored than any general video, including this one, is able to provide for your individual circumstances. Let's also briefly address how this walking habit interacts with several other topics discussed in other conversations, since cardiovascular health doesn't exist in complete isolation from your broader daily habits. The morning routine discussed in other conversations, including gradual transitions out of bed and paced breathing, works alongside consistent daily walking to support the broader blood pressure benefits discussed throughout today's video. Similarly, the muscle maintenance benefits of resistance training, discussed extensively in other conversations, work alongside cardiovascular walking as complementary rather than competing priorities, since both contribute to overall metabolic health and physical function in ways that support and reinforce each other rather than requiring you to choose one type of activity over the other. Let's also briefly mention inflammation specifically, connecting to other conversations about the role chronic, low-grade inflammation plays in various aspects of aging and health. Regular walking has been associated in research with modest reductions in certain inflammatory markers circulating in the bloodstream, markers increasingly recognized as relevant to cardiovascular disease progression specifically, beyond the more commonly discussed factors like blood pressure and cholesterol already covered throughout today's video. This represents another genuine, if less immediately visible, mechanism through which consistent walking appears to support cardiovascular health, adding to the cumulative, multi-pathway benefit picture discussed throughout this video, rather than walking supporting your heart through any single, isolated mechanism alone. For the cardiovascular changes discussed throughout today's video, since observing genuine, measurable improvement over time can provide meaningful motivation to maintain this habit consistently. Beyond simply tracking your resting heart rate as already mentioned, if you monitor your blood pressure at home as discussed in other conversations, tracking these readings over the weeks and months of building this walking habit provides another concrete, measurable way to observe the specific benefits discussed throughout today's video, offering tangible, personal confirmation of the progressive changes happening within your cardiovascular system as a direct result of your consistent effort. Let's also briefly touch on what large population studies specifically show regarding walking and long-term cardiovascular outcomes in adults over 50, since this age-specific research carries particular relevance to today's discussion. Several large, long-term studies following older adults over many years have found that those maintaining consistent, moderate walking habits, generally in the range discussed throughout today's video, show meaningfully lower rates of cardiovascular events, including heart attacks and strokes, compared to less active peers, even after accounting for other relevant factors like diet, smoking status, and existing health conditions. This population-level research, following real adults through this specific stage of life over extended periods, provides a genuinely compelling complement to the more mechanism-focused physiological changes already discussed throughout today's video, connecting the specific, progressive cellular and structural changes happening within your cardiovascular system to genuine, measurable, real-world outcomes over the years ahead. Produces a genuinely progressive series of cardiovascular changes after 50, beginning with the immediate, temporary blood pressure and heart rate response during each individual walk, followed within the first several weeks by improvements in resting heart rate and endothelial function reflecting genuine improvements in cardiac efficiency and blood vessel flexibility. Sustained blood pressure improvements typically become measurable within this same early timeframe for many people, while cholesterol profile improvements generally require a somewhat longer period of consistent practice to fully develop. Heart rate variability improvements reflect broader nervous system balance benefits, and the most significant, longest developing changes involve actual structural adaptations within your heart muscle itself, requiring sustained consistency over many months to years. Understanding this progressive timeline, rather than expecting immediate, dramatic change, provides genuine, evidence-based motivation to maintain this habit consistently, recognizing that meaningful, measurable benefit continues developing and compounding the longer you maintain this consistent daily practice. But remember, the goal isn't perfection or an unbroken, flawless daily streak, but rather genuine, sustained consistency across the majority of your days, understanding that your cardiovascular system responds to this cumulative, ongoing pattern of activity rather than requiring absolute perfection to produce the meaningful benefits discussed throughout today's video. So today, if you haven't already built this habit, consider starting with whatever duration feels genuinely manageable, even if that's considerably less than 30 minutes initially, and building gradually from there over the coming weeks. If you're already walking consistently, take a moment to appreciate that the changes discussed throughout today's video are likely already underway beneath the surface, even if you haven't yet noticed dramatic, obvious change, since the progressive timeline discussed today means genuine benefit continues compounding the longer you maintain this consistent practice. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you noticed any of the changes discussed today since building a consistent walking habit, whether in your resting heart rate, your blood pressure readings, or simply your overall energy and stamina? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may help someone else watching this video understand what genuine, evidence-based progress actually looks like as they build this same habit for themselves. If this video helped you, please like, subscribe to Nutri and turn on notifications so you don't miss more simple, practical health strategies for adults over 50. And next, watch our video on stopping vitamin D mistakes and what happens to your bones, because supporting your heart through consistent walking and supporting your bones through properly taken vitamin D both represent genuinely evidence-based, actionable habits working together to support your long-term health and independence for years to come.